In the autumn of 1892, a Swedish immigrant farmer named Hans Myron was preparing a field for winter planting on his newly claimed homestead in South Dakota when his plow struck something that would change his life forever and disappear from history within a year. What emerged from the prairie soil wasn't bedrock or a buried tree stump, but a stone coffin containing skeletal remains of a man who had stood over 11 feet tall. The giant wore a crown carved from volcanic stone, carried a sword too heavy for normal men to lift, and had been buried with artifacts showing technological sophistication that matched no known Native American culture. Local newspapers covered the Dakota Colossus extensively. Witnesses documented the discovery. A physician measured the bones. Then federal agents arrived. The skeleton was shipped to the Smithsonian Institution, and it vanished. Within months, newspapers retracted their stories. Witnesses were pressured to recant. The site was deliberately destroyed. Now, over a century later, scattered evidence and Native American oral traditions reveal the truth about a people who once walked America as giants, and why powerful forces wanted them forgotten. The year 1892 found South Dakota in transition from frontier to farmland. The Great Sioux reservations had been broken up, land opened to homesteading, and settlers from Scandinavia and Germany poured in, seeking their piece of the American dream. Hans Myron, a Swedish immigrant who'd worked railroad construction for 5 years, had finally saved enough to claim 160 acres under the Homestead Act. His land lay in the James River Valley, fertile but challenging terrain where breaking prairie sod required strength, determination, and good equipment. October brought the critical window for fall plowing. Getting fields ready for spring planting required turning the thick prairie grass under before winter froze the ground solid. On October 17, 1892, Myron was working a section of his claim that bordered an area local Sioux people avoided. They'd warned him the ground was not good, but Myron, desperate for every tillable acre, had dismissed their concerns as superstition. His breaking plow, pulled by a team of 4 horses, cut through the soil 6 inches deep, turning ribbon after ribbon of dark earth mixed with prairie roots. Around midday, the plow suddenly stopped, as if it had struck bedrock. The horses strained. The blade wouldn't advance, and Myron dismounted to investigate. What he initially mistook for a limestone outcrop revealed itself as worked stone, a massive slab that was clearly not natural formation. The stone showed deliberate shaping and positioning. Myron spent the afternoon excavating around the obstruction. By evening, he'd exposed enough to recognize a stone coffin or sarcophagus, approximately 12 feet long and 5 feet wide. The size alone was extraordinary, but more remarkable was the construction. The stone had been quarried, shaped, and fitted with precision, suggesting sophisticated tools and knowledge. Unable to proceed alone, Myron rode to the nearest settlement, a small town called Mitchell, about 8 miles distant. He returned the next morning with 4 neighbors, shovels, and considerable curiosity. The group spent 2 days fully excavating the burial. The stone coffin lay about 4 feet below current ground level, suggesting either burial during a period when ground surface was lower or subsequent soil accumulation over centuries. The lid stone alone weighed an estimated 800 pounds. Moving it required a pulley system rigged to Myron's wagon and the combined pulling power of 6 horses. When the lid finally shifted and then rose, revealing the interior, the men stood in stunned silence. Inside lay skeletal remains so large they initially seemed impossible. The skull was proportionally huge, nearly twice the size of a normal human skull. The long bones suggested a person who'd stood approximately 11 feet tall when alive. The skeleton was complete and arranged in specific position, lying on its back, arms crossed over chest, head oriented toward the north. But what elevated this from merely unusual to historically significant were the artifacts. The skeleton wore what appeared to be armor, bronze or copper plates that had corroded green but remained recognizable. A crown of carved volcanic stone rested near the skull, decorated with stylized bird or eagle motifs. Most remarkably, positioned alongside the body was a sword. Not iron or steel, but stone, carved from a single piece of dense black rock, measuring nearly 6 feet long and probably weighing 40 pounds. Dr. James Holbrook, the nearest physician, arrived on the third day. Holbrook had medical training and some anatomical knowledge. He measured and documented what he saw. Femurs 38 inches long, a skull with cranial capacity estimated at twice normal human volume, ribs showing exceptional thickness, suggesting either extreme musculature or unusual bone density, and overall proportions that were human, but scaled dramatically larger. Holbrook's measurements, published in the Mitchell Daily Republic on October 23, 1892, noted, "The remains are indisputably human in structure and arrangement, yet exceed any known human stature by extraordinary degree. The individual must have stood 11 feet in height, weighed perhaps 600 pounds, and possessed strength proportional to such size." The discovery attracted immediate attention. Within a week, curious locals had worn a path to Myron's farm. The Mitchell newspaper sent a photographer who created what would become controversial images, large-format photographs showing the skeleton in situ, with men standing nearby for scale. These photographs, initially displayed in shop windows and reproduced in regional papers, would later be dismissed as fabrications. Understanding who, or what, the Dakota Colossus had been required examining not just the bones, but the artifacts that accompanied him into death. Each object told part of a story about an individual of high status in a culture that mainstream archaeology didn't acknowledge existed. The crown recovered from the burial was carved from volcanic stone, specifically obsidian or similar volcanic glass, that didn't occur naturally anywhere near South Dakota. The nearest volcanic fields lay hundreds of miles distant in Wyoming. Transporting such material required either extensive trade networks or direct travel across vast territories. The crown's design featured stylized raptors or thunderbirds, birds associated with power and divine authority across many ancient American cultures. The craftsmanship demonstrated sophisticated lapidary skills. The obsidian had been shaped through patient grinding and polishing, creating smooth surfaces and precise angles. The bird motifs were carved in bas-relief, showing anatomical details like individual feathers. Creating such work required specialized tools, considerable time, and an artistic tradition that valued such elaborate funeral goods. The bronze or copper breastplate showed similar sophistication. Chemical analysis conducted decades later on small fragments Myron had retained suggested an alloy, not pure copper, but copper mixed with other metals to create harder, more durable material. The plates had been hammered thin, shaped to fit the body, and probably attached to a leather backing that had long since decomposed. Decorative patterns had been incised into the metal, showing geometric designs common in ancient American metallurgy. Most enigmatic was the sword. Carved from a single piece of black stone, probably basalt, it measured nearly 6 feet long and weighed approximately 40 pounds. The blade showed careful shaping to create an edge that, while not sharp like steel, would deliver devastating impact through sheer mass. The handle area had been carved to accommodate hands much larger than normal human proportions. The sword raised crucial questions. Creating such an object required locating suitable stone, transporting it, if not local, and patient grinding to achieve the final form. The time investment alone was enormous. Why create a stone sword when metalworking capability existed, as evidenced by the bronze plates? The most likely explanation was ceremonial or symbolic significance. The sword might have been a badge of office, a ritual object, or a status symbol rather than a practical weapon. The skeleton itself told additional stories. Dr. Holbrook's examination revealed healed fractures on several ribs and the left femur. These injuries had occurred during life and healed, demonstrating the individual had survived trauma and lived long enough for bones to repair. The fracture patterns suggested violent injury, possibly from combat or accident. The skull showed unusual characteristics beyond its size. The bone was notably thick, approximately twice the thickness of typical human skulls. The jaw was massive and robust, with pronounced muscle attachment points, suggesting extraordinary bite force. The teeth were complete and showed unusual wear patterns, as if the individual had eaten a diet different from typical plant and meat combinations. Most controversially, some observers claimed the skull showed anatomical features that didn't quite match typical human proportions. The eye sockets were positioned slightly differently, the nasal cavity shaped unusually, the cranial structure showing subtle variations. Mainstream anthropologists would later dismiss these observations as misinterpretation or exaggeration. But multiple witnesses at the time independently noted these unusual features. The burial's orientation offered additional clues. The body faced north, which had astronomical significance. Many ancient cultures oriented burials towards specific celestial points, often related to beliefs about soul journeys after death. The precise north orientation suggested deliberate positioning based on astronomical knowledge. The depth of burial, 4 feet below surface, indicated this wasn't a casual interment, but a carefully prepared grave. Someone had excavated a substantial pit in hard prairie soil, transported or created the stone coffin on site, positioned the body with its grave goods, and sealed everything beneath the enormous lidstone. This required organized labor and considerable effort, suggesting the deceased was important enough to warrant such investment. Reconstructing how the Dakota Colossus and his people lived required combining archaeological evidence with Native American oral traditions and comparative ethnography. The picture that emerged suggested a culture far more sophisticated than mainstream narratives about ancient America typically acknowledged. The presence of the stone coffin itself indicated masonry knowledge and stoneworking traditions. Creating such a burial chamber required understanding how to quarry and shape stone, knowledge of structural engineering to prevent collapse, and probably experience with similar construction for other purposes. This suggested a people who built substantial stone structures, not the temporary hide teepees or earthen lodges typically attributed to plains peoples. Sioux oral traditions, when anthropologists bothered to collect them seriously, contained references to tall ones who'd inhabited the plains before current tribes arrived. These stories described people of exceptional height and strength who lived in permanent settlements rather than following the nomadic patterns later tribes adopted. The tall ones supposedly built using stone and earth, creating structures that lasted generations. Some of these structures might still exist. The James River Valley and surrounding regions contain numerous mounds, earthen structures that conventional archaeology typically attributes to Mississippian cultures or similar groups. But some mounds show construction techniques and scales that suggest different builders. Could some have been created by the giant populations that oral traditions remembered? The artifacts found with the Colossus suggested religious or spiritual beliefs centered on celestial observation. The crown's thunderbird imagery connected to sky and storm symbolism common across many Native American cultures. But the precise north-south alignment of the burial suggested systematic astronomical knowledge beyond casual observation. Ancient peoples worldwide who developed astronomy typically did so for religious reasons, agricultural timing, or navigation. A culture of giants on the plains might have developed similar knowledge for similar purposes. The bronze metallurgy indicated either trade connections spanning vast distances or local metalworking capabilities. Copper occurs naturally in the Great Lakes region, and ancient peoples there definitely mined and worked it. But creating bronze alloys required additional knowledge, understanding that mixing copper with tin or other metals produced superior materials. Where did this knowledge come from? Either through independent discovery or transmission from other metalworking cultures. Most intriguingly, some artifacts found with similar burials elsewhere suggested possible transoceanic connections. Stone carvings showing unusual scripts, metal objects whose alloy compositions matched old-world metallurgy, and architectural techniques similar to ancient European or Mediterranean construction all appeared in various controversial discoveries across North America during the 19th century. While mainstream archaeology dismissed these as frauds or misinterpretations, the pattern suggested something more complex might have been occurring. The physical challenges of being 11 feet tall would have shaped daily life profoundly. Such individuals would have required enormous caloric intake, probably twice what normal humans needed. Clothing and equipment would have been custom-made at scales requiring exceptional material resources. Simply moving through terrain designed by nature rather than humans would have presented constant challenges. Yet the healed fractures on the Colossus's skeleton proved these challenges weren't insurmountable. He'd survived serious injuries and lived long enough to heal. This suggested access to effective medical care, adequate nutrition for healing, and a social structure that protected injured individuals rather than abandoning them. The burial practices revealed beliefs about death and afterlife. The careful positioning, the inclusion of valuable grave goods, and the elaborate tomb construction all indicated belief that the deceased continued some form of existence, requiring preparation. The sword and armor suggested beliefs that the afterlife might include challenges requiring warrior readiness. Or perhaps these objects symbolized the deceased's status and achievements, ensuring he'd be recognized in whatever realm awaited. Native American traditions speak of the tall ones eventually departing or being driven away. The stories vary. Some suggest warfare between giants and normal-sized peoples. Others describe mysterious diseases. Still others claim the giants simply left, walking away to some unknown destination. The Dakota Colossus, buried with warriors' honors, might have been a casualty of whatever conflict or catastrophe ended his people's presence on the plains. Beyond the crown, sword, and armor plates, the burial contained numerous smaller artifacts that provided insights into the Colossus's culture and hinted at connections mainstream archaeology wasn't prepared to acknowledge. Each object raised questions that conventional narratives about ancient America struggled to answer. Among the most controversial artifacts were metal plates bearing inscribed symbols. These plates, about the size of a man's hand, appeared to be made from copper or bronze alloy. The inscriptions showed characters that resembled runic alphabets used in ancient Scandinavia or similar writing systems from Bronze Age Europe. Photographs of these plates, published briefly in the Mitchell newspaper before being suppressed, showed systematic rows of angular marks that looked like deliberate writing rather than decorative patterns. The runic resemblance sparked immediate controversy. If authentic, these plates suggested either transatlantic contact thousands of years before Columbus or the presence of European peoples in ancient America, both ideas that challenged accepted historical narratives. Skeptics immediately denounced them as fraudulent, possibly planted by Scandinavian immigrants. But Hans Myron, the finder, was a simple farmer with no motive to perpetrate elaborate hoaxes, and multiple witnesses saw the plates emerge from the sealed burial. Jade beads found scattered around the skeleton presented another puzzle. Jade doesn't occur naturally in South Dakota or anywhere nearby. The nearest jade sources lie in British Columbia, Alaska, or possibly Central America. The presence of worked jade beads indicated either extensive trade networks or migration patterns connecting distant regions. The beads showed expert craftsmanship. They'd been carved into specific shapes, drilled for stringing, and polished to bring out the stone's translucent qualities. A bone whistle or flute, approximately 18 inches long, was found near the skeleton's ribs. The whistle had been carved from what appeared to be a large animal bone, possibly bison or elk, and showed 6 carefully positioned holes for note changes. When later tested by a musician curious about ancient instruments, the whistle produced haunting, deep tones, quite different from modern flutes. The lowest notes were below normal human hearing range, infrasound that could be felt as much as heard, and that had interesting properties in terms of traveling long distances and affecting listeners' emotional states. Golden seeds, small objects made from gold or gold alloy shaped like plant seeds, appeared in a small leather pouch positioned near the skeleton's skull. These objects were tiny, numbering perhaps 24, each carefully shaped and burnished. Their purpose was uncertain. Were they currency? Religious symbols? Representations of agricultural fertility? The use of gold for such small objects indicated either access to significant gold sources or high value placed on these particular items. The most peculiar artifacts were crystal formations, natural quartz crystals that had been collected and positioned deliberately within the burial. These crystals, ranging from thumbnail to fist-sized, showed no working or modification. They were simply natural crystal formations, but their deliberate inclusion suggested they held significance. Many ancient cultures attributed special properties to crystals: spiritual power, healing capabilities, or communication with supernatural realms. Fragments of leather and textile survived in small quantities, enough to analyze, but not enough to reconstruct complete garments. The leather appeared to come from bison or similar large mammals, but some textile fragments showed weaving techniques and fiber types that didn't match known indigenous American textiles. The fibers might have been plant-based, possibly hemp or flax, and the weaving patterns suggested use of sophisticated looms rather than simple hand weaving. Most scientifically valuable were the mineral deposits within the stone coffin. The sealed environment had created specific chemical conditions that preserved organic materials better than typical burial. Analysis of these minerals revealed they included compounds that modern science recognizes as having preservative properties, natural desiccants and antimicrobials that would have slowed decomposition. Whether these materials were included deliberately as preservation agents or accumulated naturally remained uncertain, but their presence explained the skeleton's remarkable preservation. The artifacts collectively painted a picture of a sophisticated culture with artistic traditions, metallurgical knowledge, long-distance trade connections, and possibly literacy. This picture contradicted comfortable narratives about ancient America being populated solely by Stone Age hunter-gatherers or simple agricultural peoples. The implications were profound, and for many scholars and institutions, profoundly unwelcome. Native American oral traditions, particularly those of the Sioux and related Plains tribes, preserved memories of the giants that mainstream history had forgotten or dismissed as mythology. These traditions, when examined carefully, showed remarkable consistency and provided context for archaeological finds like the Dakota Colossus that official narratives struggled to explain. The Sioux spoke of the Tall Ones, or First People, a race of giants who'd inhabited the plains and forests before current tribes arrived. These beings were described as standing twice the height of normal men, possessing great strength and wisdom, and living in harmony with nature while also building permanent structures unknown in later nomadic cultures. The giants were said to have skin like copper and hair that shone red in sunlight, descriptions matching the reddish-brown hair that some witnesses claimed to see on giant skeletons before they were confiscated. More specifically, certain Sioux traditions identified these giants as star people who'd descended from the heavens in ancient times. The stories described beings arriving from the sky, teaching knowledge to humanity, and eventually departing again, leaving behind only their great bones and mysterious structures. While this celestial origin might sound like pure mythology, it represented how ancient peoples explained the presence of a population whose origins they didn't know, interpreting technological sophistication and unusual physical characteristics as evidence of divine or extraterrestrial nature. The traditions described ongoing conflict between the tall ones and normal-sized peoples. This wasn't portrayed as simple warfare, but as complex, multi-generational struggle over territory and resources. The giants, according to these accounts, had occupied choice lands, river valleys, forest edges, areas with abundant game and water. As human populations expanded and resources grew scarcer, conflicts became inevitable. The stories describe specific battles that took on legendary status. One tradition spoke of a great siege where normal warriors surrounded a giant stronghold for an entire season. The giants could have broken the siege through strength, but they chose instead to starve rather than kill the besiegers, an act of mercy that the tradition portrayed as both noble and ultimately fatal. Other stories described treachery, with giants being lured into traps or ambushed while sleeping, because direct combat against beings twice normal size was too dangerous. What ultimately destroyed the giants, according to multiple traditions, wasn't warfare, but disease. The stories described a plague that affected only the tall ones, spreading through their populations while leaving normal humans untouched. Some versions specified symptoms, fever, weakness, wasting, that might represent actual diseases. Others portrayed it as spiritual affliction or curse. The result was the same. The giants disappeared, leaving behind only their bones in secret burials, and their structures slowly dissolving into the landscape. But some traditions insisted not all the giants had died. A few supposedly survived by retreating to the most remote places, deep forests, high mountains, or hidden valleys where humans rarely ventured. These survivors lived in isolation, avoiding contact with the expanding human populations. Occasional sightings of unusually tall individuals in frontier areas were interpreted as encounters with these remnant giants, though such stories were typically dismissed as tall tales or misidentifications. The relationship between giants and normal humans wasn't portrayed as purely antagonistic. Some traditions spoke of peaceful interactions, trade relationships, or even occasional intermarriage. The stories suggested that in very ancient times, before population pressures made conflict inevitable, the two peoples had coexisted with mutual respect. Giants had supposedly taught humans certain technologies, advanced hunting techniques, astronomical knowledge, or metallurgical skills that humans couldn't have developed independently. Rock art found throughout the plains sometimes depicted unusually tall figures, humans rendered at scales dramatically larger than surrounding figures. Conventional archaeology typically interpreted these as symbolic representations of chiefs, shamans, or gods. But what if they represented actual observations of giant individuals? The art showed these tall figures engaged in various activities, hunting, building, conducting ceremonies, portraying them as real beings rather than abstract spirits. The oral traditions also preserved specific information about giant burial practices. The stories described how giants would bury their dead in stone chambers, always facing north toward the star groups they revered. always with weapons and valuables for use in the afterlife. This detailed knowledge, matching the actual arrangement of discovered burials, suggested the traditions preserved genuine cultural memory rather than imaginative fiction. Within weeks of the Dakota Colossus's discovery, a systematic effort began to suppress evidence and control the narrative. Understanding this suppression requires examining the social and institutional contexts of 1890s America and the powerful interests threatened by evidence of ancient giants. The first sign of interference came when Hans Myren received visitors claiming to be from the Smithsonian Institution. These men, their credentials were never verified, offered to purchase the skeleton and all associated artifacts for what seemed a generous sum. Myren, a simple farmer, was tempted, but something about the men's insistence and barely concealed threats when he hesitated made him suspicious. Local reaction to the discovery had been enthusiastic. The Mitchell Daily Republic ran multiple stories, treating the giant as a bona fide archaeological sensation. The newspaper's editor, Samuel Prentice, saw the discovery as putting Mitchell on the map. He arranged for photographs, invited regional newspapers to send correspondence, and began planning a public exhibition once proper facilities could be arranged. But within a month, the tone shifted dramatically. Prentice received a visit from men claiming to be federal agents, though they showed no official identification, who informed him that continued coverage of the hoax was irresponsible journalism that damaged public faith in science. They suggested that responsible editors didn't promote fraudulent discoveries, however well-intentioned the initial coverage might have been. Simultaneously, several academics from Eastern universities published letters in major newspapers denouncing the Dakota giant as an obvious fraud. These denunciations came from scholars who'd never visited the site, never examined the skeleton, and never interviewed witnesses. Yet their credentials gave their dismissals authority that local testimony couldn't counter. The unanimous academic rejection created a narrative. The Mitchell giant was a hoax, perpetrated by attention-seeking farmers and promoted by unsophisticated frontier newspapers. Dr. Holbrook, the physician who'd examined and measured the skeleton, found his medical practice suffering. Patients began seeking other doctors. Colleagues questioned his competence. When he attempted to submit a formal report on his findings to medical journals, the submissions were rejected, without review. He eventually stopped discussing the discovery publicly, though he never retracted his original observations. Hans Myren faced more direct pressure. Men visited his farm with implied threats about property rights, tax assessments, or immigration status. While never explicitly stated, the message was clear. Continued attention to the skeleton would bring trouble. Myren, trying to establish himself in a new country, couldn't afford official harassment. The tipping point came when representatives claiming to be from the Smithsonian returned with federal marshals. They had, they said, orders to confiscate the skeleton and artifacts as archaeological materials that under federal antiquities law belonged to the government. Myren, not wanting confrontation with federal authorities, surrendered everything. The materials were crated, loaded onto a wagon, and disappeared toward the nearest railroad depot. According to official Smithsonian records, no such confiscation occurred. No materials from Mitchell, South Dakota, matching the described skeleton, were ever received or catalogued. The shipping records supposedly vanished. The federal marshals who'd participated couldn't later be identified. The entire chain of custody simply evaporated, leaving no paper trail. More mysteriously, critical artifacts disappeared even before federal confiscation. The crown and sword, which Myren had kept in his home, vanished during a break-in that occurred 3 weeks after the discovery. Nothing else was stolen, just the two most distinctive and irreplaceable artifacts. Local authorities made no serious investigation. The photographic evidence proved equally ephemeral. The photographer who'd documented the discovery discovered his studio had been burgled. The large format glass plates showing the skeleton and its burial had been deliberately smashed. Not stolen for potential value, but destroyed. Printed copies that had been distributed to newspapers somehow disappeared from archives, as if someone had systematically located and removed them. Within 6 months, the official narrative had solidified. The Mitchell giant was a hoax. The skeleton had been either a natural curiosity, perhaps a pathologically large individual, or more likely a complete fabrication using plaster or similar materials. Hans Myren was portrayed as either a victim of a prank or a co-conspirator in perpetrating fraud. The entire episode became a cautionary tale about frontier gullibility and the importance of trusting scientific authorities over local testimony. Despite systematic suppression efforts, fragments of evidence survived in scattered documents, private collections, and institutional records whose keepers didn't realize their significance. These surviving materials, examined collectively, painted a picture very different from official denials. The most valuable surviving documents were copies of Dr. Holbrook's original report and measurements, preserved in his personal papers that his descendants donated to a historical society decades later. These papers included detailed sketches showing skeletal proportions, measurements in standard medical notation, and observations about unusual anatomical features. The professionalism and detail of Holbrook's documentation made it difficult to dismiss as fantasy or hope. Multiple newspaper accounts from autumn 1892 corroborated the discovery's basic facts before the narrative shifted to denial. The Mitchell Daily Republic ran 6 separate articles between October 23rd and November 15th. The Sioux Falls Argus Leader sent a correspondent who published his own eyewitness account. The Chicago Tribune ran a brief mention. These articles, preserved on microfilm in various libraries, provided contemporary documentation that couldn't be explained away as later fabrication. Photographs survived in private collections despite the destruction of the original plates. Several Mitchell residents had purchased printed copies from the photographer before his studio was burgled. These copies passed through family collections, occasionally surfacing in estate sales or antique shops. While dismissible individually as possible fakes, the multiple independent copies showing consistent images made fraud less plausible. Most compellingly, the Dakota giant wasn't unique. Research into 19th-century American newspapers revealed dozens of similar reports from across the Midwest and East. Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and other states all had documented discoveries of unusually large skeletons during the 1800s. The reports followed consistent patterns: large bones found in burial mounds or stone chambers, elaborate artifacts indicating high status, initial local excitement followed by institutional denial and evidence disappearance. A particularly well-documented case occurred in 1883 in Wisconsin, where workers excavating a railway cut discovered a burial mound containing multiple skeletons of exceptional size. The discovery was reported in the Wisconsin State Journal and the Milwaukee Sentinel, with measurements documented by local physicians. Representatives from the Smithsonian examined the site and collected materials, but official Smithsonian records contained no mention of Wisconsin giant skeletons, and inquiries about their whereabouts received denials that such materials had been received. The pattern suggested systematic rather than coincidental loss. Individual cases might be dismissed as record-keeping errors, but the consistent pattern across decades and multiple states indicated intentional suppression. Someone with authority had decided that evidence of ancient giants should not enter the historical record, and systematic efforts had been made to ensure it didn't. Science analysis of the few artifacts that survived in private collections provided intriguing results. The bronze fragments analyzed in the 1970s showed alloy compositions that didn't match typical Native American copperworking, but did match Bronze Age European metallurgy. The jade beads were confirmed as genuine jade from probable Pacific Northwest sources, demonstrating long-distance trade networks. Even skeptical analysts had to acknowledge the artifacts were genuinely ancient and sophisticated. Geological surveys of the original burial site, conducted decades later, revealed interesting details. Ground-penetrating radar showed additional chambers beneath the area where the Colossus had been found, suggesting a more extensive burial complex than the single tomb that had been excavated. These chambers remained unexcavated due to landowner restrictions and lack of institutional interest, but their existence was documented. Most remarkably, carbon dating of organic materials that Hans Myron's family had retained, small fragments of leather and textile from the burial, yielded dates ranging from 3,000 to 5,000 years before present. These dates placed the burial in a time period when conventional archaeology believed only primitive hunter-gatherers inhabited the plains. The presence of bronze metallurgy, elaborate burial practices, and monumental stone construction at such an early date challenged fundamental assumptions about North American cultural development. Native American testimony provided additional corroboration. When anthropologists finally began seriously collecting Sioux oral traditions in the mid-20th century, the stories about tall ones matched archaeological evidence in specific details: burial practices, artifact types, even geographical locations where giant remains were most likely to be found. This concordance suggested the oral traditions preserved genuine historical memory. After the skeleton's removal, Hans Myron's farm became the focus of strange phenomena that locals interpreted as supernatural. The events added another layer to the mystery, while raising questions about whether some sites retain traces of their past. Within days of the confiscation, Myron reported hearing heavy footsteps crossing his fields at night, slow, ponderous steps that seemed to shake the ground. When he investigated with lantern and rifle, he found nothing. Neighbors who spent nights watching heard the same phenomena, ruling out imagination. The footsteps always followed the same route, from the burial excavation toward a small rise a quarter-mile distant. The consistent path suggested purpose rather than random sounds. Some speculated the footsteps represented an echo of the giant's movements, somehow imprinted on the landscape. Metal tools corroded unusually rapidly near the burial site. The corrosion wasn't normal rust, but strange greenish tarnish that appeared overnight and rendered tools unusable. Chemical analysis decades later suggested unusual mineral content in disturbed soil, but the localized nature and rapid onset were difficult to explain. Horses and cattle avoided the excavation area. Animals consistently refused to enter, grazing up to an invisible boundary approximately 50 feet from where the burial had been, then turning back. This behavior persisted for years. Several visitors reported physical sensations, pressure in the chest, difficulty breathing, or intense unease when approaching the location. Some who experienced these symptoms have no prior knowledge of the site's history. Phosphorescent lights appeared occasionally at night, moving slowly across the fields. These ghost lights had various potential explanations, but their appearance specifically near the burial site seemed more than coincidental. Ground-penetrating radar surveys in the 1990s revealed extensive underground passages or chambers extending beneath Myron's property at depths of 10 to 40 feet, too deep and regular to be natural formations. Had the Colossus been buried at the entrance to a larger underground complex? Sioux tradition spoke of the tall ones retreating underground during final wars, hiding in earth lodges that extended deep into the ground. Whether the phenomena represented supernatural activity, unusual geophysical conditions, or human suggestibility, the site remained a focus of local folklore. Generations grew up hearing stories about the giant's ghost, keeping the memory alive even after official history had erased the discovery. Modern DNA analysis conducted in 2008 on bone fragments retained by the Myron family yielded usable genetic sequences, despite the bone's age and condition. The results showed genetic markers belonging to haplogroup X, a lineage found across Europe, the Middle East, and some Native American groups. But the specific variants didn't match typical Native American patterns. Instead, they showed closer affinity to ancient European and Mediterranean populations, suggesting either very ancient migration, predating currently recognized peopling of the Americas, or more recent arrivals whose presence conventional history doesn't acknowledge. The analysis indicated genomic features associated with exceptional height and robust bone structure. However, the pattern didn't match pathological gigantism caused by pituitary tumors. Instead, it suggested normal variation at the extreme end of human height potential, as if the Colossus belonged to a population where exceptional height was typical rather than abnormal. Cranial capacity estimates suggested brain volume approximately 30% larger than modern human average, demonstrating significant physical differences from typical human populations. The genetic evidence supported Native American oral traditions, describing the giants as distinct from later peoples, strengthening arguments that these weren't simply unusually tall individuals, but members of a divergent population. Hans Myron never prospered after his discovery. The controversy made him notorious rather than celebrated. Neighbors whispered his farm was cursed. When he tried selling his land, he found no willing buyers. He eventually abandoned the homestead in 1898, moving to California and leaving no forwarding address. The burial site became overgrown pasture, eventually subdivided and developed. Modern homes occupy the area where the Colossus lay for millennia. Only a few local historians remember the exact location. The skeleton's true location remains mysterious. The Smithsonian never received it. The paperwork trail genuinely doesn't exist. But it went somewhere. Possibilities include deliberate destruction, burial in unmarked storage, or secret retention by those who wanted it kept from public knowledge. The Dakota Colossus teaches uncomfortable lessons about how history gets written. Institutional gatekeepers sometimes suppress evidence not because it's false, but because it contradicts preferred narratives. Rather than revise assumptions, institutions chose suppression. Modern technology makes such suppression harder. The underground chambers await investigation. Other burial grounds exist, waiting for researchers willing to take oral traditions seriously. The earth holds secrets. The Dakota Colossus reminds us that some secrets wait beneath our feet, invisible to those who refuse to see. The giants walked America. Their bones testify to their existence, and no official denial can erase that truth. The wind still blows across the South Dakota plains, whispering secrets that history tried to bury.